to some extent, the way that spot advertising is done today, it's a byproduct of another time. It's a byproduct of a time of linear entertainment where we really didn't have the choice to skip ads, didn't have as many options as we used to. Our choice was really to sit through the ads or maybe even watch or listen to them, right? In exchange for the content that we're going to get. But today, of course, consumers have a lot more choice. They're not stuck on trains for 2 hours in the dark, wishing they even had an ad to look at in that period of time. But I think the goalposts then have changed for consumer tolerance of things like repetition, of how many ads that they will sit through, where they want those ads, because ultimately, if an ad is skipped, it doesn't work. Ad skipping occurs in every medium. I've seen various statistics from various other channels. Most of the data I have seen from online video, for instance, is north of 90%. I've even seen a 99% figure for YouTube in terms of the percentage of humans who skip those ads, especially the ads at the beginning. So ad skipping is it's not a problem that's endemic to podcasting. It's something that's endemic to advertising, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I want to get into the study and into some of the things that we looked at because some of what we're going to talk about today have not even been studied in podcasting. And that's really ultimately one of our goals that Sounds Profitable is to shine a light where it hasn't been shined yet, or shone, or shown, English major, and uncover some of these facts that have really kind of yet to be discovered. I want to thank Gavin for setting things up here at the beginning. Some of you have attended our webinars in the past may notice that Gavin is not Manuela. Manuela has moved on to have a baby, and we wish Manuela extremely well in her next journey as a mom. Gavin stepped in admirably, and we're also happy to welcome Newt Shadlakati to our team here at Sounds Profitable, who's going to be helping us with production and some other things kind of behind the scenes. Newt's actually been in the space for a long time. Some of you may be familiar with their work as well. So welcome, Newt. But let's get into the webinar. Let's get into some of the things that we want to talk about today in terms of ad skipping, frequency, repetition, and some of the unpleasantries of advertising that we don't often talk about. Ad nauseam, of course, is Latin for ads that make you throw up, in case you were wondering. Before we go on, I want to thank our generous sponsors, competitors, collaborators, various companies in the space, all pooling together to help make this pool of knowledge available for you where it did not exist before. So enormous gratitude from us at Sounds Profitable to the team at Wondery, to ESPN Podcasts, to BetterHelp, SiriusXM Podcast Network. I just got off a webinar with them, to Libsyn Ads, to Paramount, to NPR, and to our research partners, Signal Hill, who were instrumental in helping us put all of this together. It's been a really interesting study, a really rewarding study. And in terms of how it was put together, we put this together with Signal Hill to produce a look at weekly podcast consumers. And for something like this, that's a deeper dive on podcast ads, we wanted to make sure that we were getting regular consumers of those ads. So this is a survey of 1,011 weekly podcast consumers. They were asked all kinds of things about ad skipping, ad frequency, and their tolerance for good ads, their tolerance for bad ads. And we'll get into all of that in just a moment. This is our 11th study in 2 years at Sounds Profitable. We have just been producing, I think, some of the best quality research in the space, commissioned by us, supported by our partners, our research partners, in partnership with our friends at Signal Hill Insights. This is, I mentioned, our 11th study. 8 of them have been about advertising. And ultimately, podcast ads work. We know that they work. The audience is the right audience. The medium is the right medium. But sometimes you can have too much of a good thing. So we're going to start off here by just general awareness of advertising, period. When was the last time you heard a podcast that had advertisements in it? So in terms of our sample of weekly listeners, about a third said the day that they took the survey, another 40% yesterday, and the rest within the past week. So a fairly recent look here at some of the ads, because some of the questions that we asked were about the last podcast you heard or the last ad you heard. So we wanted to make sure there was enough kind of recency in the sample. We asked them how they thought about ads in general. And I love this question, and I wrote about this a week ago in the newsletter. If you've ever heard a creator tell you, well, my audience wouldn't tolerate ads, or my audience would leave if I ran ads. Well, if your audience would leave if you ran ads, then you never really had them, friends. Set them free. Set them free. Because people do tolerate ads. Only 1% say that they're intolerable, and another 8% say they're disruptive and barely tolerable. And by the way, that percentage, and it's about 8 to 10%, is true across a lot of the questions in this survey and a lot of other media platforms. There's a percentage of Americans, and it is in that just under 10%, who are just ragingly anti-ad and anti-interruption, and that's true regardless of medium. So that's not unique to podcasting. It's not endemic to podcasting, but there absolutely is a slice of America that just won't tolerate advertising, and they show up time and time again in various questions that we look at. But most people are actually very tolerant of advertising. So if you genuinely believe that your audience would leave you if you ran an ad, uh, then you either are an incredible exception to the rule. Maybe your audience is entirely that 1%, in which case you have built yourself a cranky show, my friends. I don't envy you. In terms of by gender, there's a bit more approval and enjoyment amongst male podcast consumers than female. And there's a little bit of a bump here, I think 35 to 49 rate kind of in the middle in terms of demographically. But again, across gender, across age, the percent who find ads intolerable is a single percentage point. So are they there? Yes. Are they there in numbers? Probably not on a podcast per podcast or a show by show basis, right? So we know that people are receptive, people are attentive. We've proven that in a variety of studies, and they also work. So we asked just a couple of quick questions to kind of level set here. 58% of this sample say they've discovered a product or service that they liked through a podcast ad, and another 45% actually made a purchase. So we know there's a significant amount of purchase behavior that's been driven in this sample. Again, even a sample that contains 1% who say, I find them intolerable, we know that advertising works. But there is ad skipping. And I'm thrilled to put out some of this data about ad skipping. There really hasn't been a lot of ad skipping data put out, not just in podcasting, but in any media platform. And the reason for that is simple. Most consumers will overstate how much they skip ads. They'll answer it the way they would like to answer it, in a kind of performative way. They will tell you, "Oh, I always skip ads," right? But as a media researcher, I know that that's simply not the case, and that's no better example of that than from the large body of research collected, 20, 25 years ago from things like TiVo and digital video recorders, if you remember those from the previous century. People would often say in a survey, I always skip ads, but TiVo actually had the data that showed how often they really did, and it was nowhere near that often. So people can be performative about that. And when you ask them in a hypothetical, how do you typically react when an ad starts playing in a podcast? You'll see 39% say they'll skip it if possible, right? 30% continue listening, 26% leave the ad on but ignore it. 39% will say that they skip the ad if possible. Now, two things about this. Number one, as I mentioned, it is a bit of a performative stat when it's asked in a hypothetical. And number two, I've seen this data for other media channels, and that number is much, much higher. Ask that in a YouTube survey again, and you'll see something, potentially double that or even higher in terms of, it's very easy to skip an ad and in terms of their placement in YouTube, but other channels as well. And then, of course, there are plenty of other media platforms where this data does not even exist. And I think the podcast industry, I'm very proud to put this out, very proud to contextualize it. But there's also, I think, some things that we can do about ad skipping uniquely in podcasting that are not available to other media platforms. So this isn't a hypothetical, but if you ground that question in a specific instance, a specific familiar podcast, you will actually get, I think, a little bit more close to reality result about this. Think of the last podcast episode you listened to that contained ads. How did you react to them? Well, 68% said that they listened to them. 17% skipped all of them. That's far lower than that 39% who say they hypothetically skip every ad, right? When you ground them in a familiar instance with a podcast that they like, that they just listen to, then what you'll see is that actually most people pay attention to most of the ads. And again, I would put podcasting's numbers here up against any other ad supported medium, particularly any other medium where you can skip ads that easily. So, still, it does happen, right? Ad skipping does occur. Ad skipping occurs in podcasting, it occurs in online video, it gets blocked in display and other sort of digital online vehicles, right? It's going to happen. When you ask people again, sort of in general, how often do you do it? 16% will tell you they always do it, another 29 often. You put those two together with a little rounding there. 46% say they always or often will skip ads on their favorite podcast, and then 30% say sometimes, and so on. When you look at this by gender, I mentioned a little bit earlier that men were sort of a little less prone to do this sort of thing. You see this as well in this particular question. How often do you skip ads on your favorite podcast? Women are more likely to say that they do this always than men. And there's also a little bit of an age component to this as well, which is why I'm going to show you that. Younger, 18 to 34, are more likely to say that they do it. And again, I want to emphasize here, these are perception questions, not actual behavior questions. And when you ground these questions in a specific example, you actually, I think you get somewhat more precise results. But the younger demographics here, a little bit more likely to say that they often will skip ads on their favorite podcast. But going back to the data that I showed you earlier, when we asked about the last show that you heard, well, 68% said that they listened to some or all of the ads. Now, why do we skip ads? Well, there's a whole host of reasons why we skip ads, and I'm going to get to those towards the end of the webinar because there's a lot of things that we as an industry can actually do about ad skipping. It's not this sort of monolithic phenomenon that cannot be avoided. I think it actually can be avoided in many cases. But I do want to single out one thing kind of early here, and that is that the creators of shows, the shows themselves, the producers of podcasts do play a role in all of this. And there's two questions in particular that I found interesting about that. Number one, this question: are you more likely to skip ads in your favorite podcast compared to podcasts that you've just started listening to? And you know what? It's a wash. As many people say that they're more likely to skip ads in their favorite show than they are less likely to skip ads in their favorite show, with the overwhelming choice here being about the same. And I found that a curious answer. It seems to speak to a lack of connection here between skipping the ad and harming the creator, right? To the audience, it may not seem like a big deal to them. So they do it with their favorite shows, they do it with their second favorite shows, right? And that gets a lot clearer in this next question. Do you believe skipping ads affects your support for your favorite podcast? And 59% said, no, it doesn't affect my support. Well, it does affect your support. It does affect the support that you have for your favorite podcast. It does affect the performance of those ads. And so, one thing I would suggest, and I'll mention this again towards the end of the webinar when I wrap this up with some findings, is that these linkages, I think we need to find more comfortable ways to talk about them and educate the audience a little bit about how advertising and podcasts work. We're not doing it for our health. We're not doing it to willfully interrupt the content and reduce the listener experience. We are doing it for performance. And I think if we make stronger linkages here between what it is that we're doing, the impact of skipping ads, and the impact that that might have on the podcast and on the creator, I think that might help. These last two questions, basically in general, show me that there's a lack of education about what ad skipping really does. So ultimately, though, and this is really, I think, the money question here, when asked about how often they pay attention to ads, podcast listeners are the most attentive media consumers. Think about any negative stat you just saw, any stat about ad skipping, any stat about wishing things to be other than they are, and put it in context with this graph. This is the percentage of people who say they watch or listen to all of the ads that they encounter in each of these media. So with podcasting, again, and this is from our previous study, the ad bargain, 28% of podcast listeners say they watch or listen to all of the ads in podcasts. Well, look at TikTok, that's 14%, YouTube, 10%, even CTV at 18%. All of the things that I'm talking about today with ad skipping are true in all of these other media platforms as well, in terms of people wanting to skip ads, wanting to skip bad ads. But the podcast audience is the most attentive. Now, that's ad skipping in general. And I mentioned we'll come back to some of the reasons for ad skipping at the end. There's also ad quantity to talk about because sometimes we may believe, people will skip ads because there's too many. So, how many is too many? Well, it's difficult to come up with one single answer to this, right? Because you could want to skip one really bad ad and you could want to listen to five really great ads in a row. So it's hard to find a hard and fast rule here, but there are at least consumer expectations. And those consumer expectations are really the sum total of all of their experiences with podcasting, their experiences with other media platforms. So people can tell you what they expect to hear. Execution matters, execution changes everything, but there are expectations. When we ask people, have you ever stopped listening to a podcast altogether because you felt it had too many ads? 30% said that they have done that, right? So we can push the boundaries. We can push things a little bit too far with ad quantity. And I've heard some podcasts that are appalling with ad quantity. I've heard some podcasts really that have featured, 12, 14 ads in the run of a show. And the show might be a little bit longer, but people really notice that in the context of the other shows that they're listening to. And that's the consumer expectations part of it. So it's not that any one number is too much or too little, but if a number is higher or lower than what people are used to, that feeds that perception. So how many ads do people recall hearing in the last episode that they heard that had ads? It's about three, right? It's split here. 30% said two, 37% said three, but it averages out across all of these to about three ads is what people recall hearing. Now, many podcasts, especially a 30-minute podcast, they might have a pre-roll, a couple of mid-rolls, and a post-roll. People may not hear the post-roll, right? This is not necessarily saying that, but what they are telling you is that they are recalling, in general, in a typical experience, hearing three ads. Now, how many is three? Is three a lot? Is three a little? Well, as it turns out here, it's just right. When we ask people if the last podcast episode that they listened to had too few, too many, fewer than expected, or just the right number of ads, well, the overwhelming response here is just the right amount of ads. And in fact, if you add up with the total here, just the right amount with fewer than expected, 2/3 of podcast listeners say that what they're getting in general is pretty good, right? The answer here is not zero. They're not expecting zero to be just right. They're expecting to hear two or three ads, and that's pretty much what they're getting. Now, there is a percentage here that are saying they got too many, and that, again, those may have been the people that in the previous graph responded that they got 6 or 7 ads, right? It's hard to tell the specific reason for that. But just playing the percentages here, most people are generally getting what they expect in the form of 2 or 3 ads that they recall. This also works out with men and women, right? And that typically works out again with men being slightly more positive about it. 69% of men said just right or fewer than expected, compared to 62% for women. So that's a little bit different again. And then we ask them again that frame of their favorite podcast. Think about your favorite podcast that also has ads. How many total ads do you expect to hear in a typical episode of that podcast? Again, the average here is 3. So that is an expectation. That is an expectation. It is not a rule that I'm giving you. It is not a number that you must conform to. And most of the shows that our partner companies, I think, feature will typically have one more than that, or maybe 2 more than that in different ad breaks. But this is a perception question. And so we need to know if we're going to dramatically violate that perception, that there A, could either be results, or B, we need to do something else to mitigate that. Now, while the actual number of ads that feature in a listener's favorite show could exceed that number, that general sense that perceiving 2 or 3 in a typical episode is just right is something we need to keep in the back of our minds. But consumers are forgiving about this, right? They will cut you some slack. We asked them, if an episode of your favorite podcast had more ads than you expected, what would you do? 3/4 would listen as they normally do. And by the way, that 3/4 number is a good one to park in the back of your head. It shows up a lot. That's really, I think, the average, we're kind of good with things number. And you're going to see that come up in a few other cases. People might say, I'd rather there were fewer. I'd rather there were better. But in general, about 3/4 of your audience, if it's their favorite podcast, they're good with it. They're going to go along with you. There are some people that say they would stop listening to that episode, and that's a real number. And there's a smaller percentage that say they would consider unsubscribing from the podcast. Again, that's that 9-10% of hyper cranky people that I talked about early. Um, you may or may not ever be able to do anything about them, right? So most people will go along with you if you have a slip or a violation of this. And this is also true if your podcast goes long. Imagine your favorite podcast has an episode that's twice as long as usual, but you hear more ads compared to a typical episode. Again, how would that impact your listening? About 60% say it wouldn't. Another 35% say they would just take a break from the episode and listen later. So again, people are rewarding you for longer content. They're not punishing you if it takes a few more ads in there. They will go along with you. People who listen to your show generally like you. So that's a little bit on quantity, but that's not the only thing that matters with podcast advertising. There's also where they're placed and how they're positioned. So consumers, as I mentioned before, they're not necessarily reliable narrators about the quantity of ads. That perception of 3 comes up a lot as an average. But part of that perception, I think, is how ads are placed in the context of a show. And as I mentioned, there's certainly a percentage of the audience that will never hear a pre-roll. That's why the pre-rolls are priced differently. And so they may never perceive that as a break or as an ad break. When you ask people, how many times was there an ad break in the podcast episode that you heard? This is referring to the last one that they listened to. It's sort of split here between 1 to 2 and 3 to 5. On the low end of that 3 to 5, I would suggest. 5% said 6 or more ad breaks. And there's sort of an interesting thing about that. There's a couple cases in which I would consider that 6+ ad breaks to be either true or perceived as true. One is if it is, a completely, catch up radio kind of thing, right? Or it's confused somehow with broadcast radio, because broadcast radio has a lot of ad breaks and has a lot of ads. But another is when people hear repeated ads or ads that they really don't like, that tends to feed into that I'm hearing too many, I'm not hearing enough variety. One thing I can tell you from years and years of music testing in the entertainment business is people's perception of variety is not based on a sheer number or a sheer different number of types of songs or whatever it is that you're testing. It's based on not hearing things you don't like. It's kind of an interesting, well-researched thing about variety. People will perceive variety if they hear a lot of things that they like. And if they start to hear a number of things they don't like that stick with them, that actually feeds into their perception that there's not enough variety because they're noticing the repeated things that really irk them. We'll get to repetition here in a little bit. Where would you prefer to hear podcast ads? Most people would prefer to hear them within the show itself, sandwiched by content, spread out evenly during the middle as a break. You can roll both of those up 57% basically as a mid-roll. Another quarter, say, at the beginning of the podcast, and then another 19% at the end. But most people, again, this is about expectation. This is not a rule. Prefer to hear the ads spread out in the content. It is certainly a personal soapbox thing for me that so many podcasts begin with an ad in the same way that a YouTube video begins with a pre-roll before there's any content whatsoever. I've never liked that practice. I think that invites skipping, if nothing else. But I think the consumer here is telling you, at least the majority of podcast listeners, that they like to have content sandwiching those advertisements. So given that they do, they can be more tolerant and even expectant of multiple ad breaks because they're getting content before and after those ad breaks. So structure and positioning, I think, all play a role here. How many times do you expect a 30-minute podcast episode to take a break for ads? About a third, a little more than a third, say once at the beginning or in the middle, and half say twice, once at the beginning and once in the middle, and then a smaller percentage 3 times. So again, 1 to 2 ad breaks in the middle of a podcast, not a rule, but a preference, an expectation that people have based on all of the other things that they consume. So don't take it as gospel, but do take it as if you're going to violate this sort of perception by a lot, that you need to mitigate that somehow. You need to take some steps to make it not out of the ordinary in a bad way, but different. Now, you can have too many ads. And more importantly, it can feel like there are too many ads when people hear the same ads and the same creative execution of that ad multiple times in an episode. And this is something that rears its head not just in everyone's favorite thing to critique, programmatic advertising. No, I hear it in host read ads. I hear it all the time. The same creative execution of an ad. And when you start to hear that too many times, even in the same ad position, in multiple episodes, if not within the same episode, all of that can make people think that they're hearing too many ads, or other sort of negative aspects about advertising that may or may not be related to repetition. It can come back to you as a statement on quality, or a statement on how many ads that you have, right? Again, have you ever stopped listening to a podcast episode because you heard the same ad too many times? Three quarters go along to get along, as we talked about. No, say 76%, but a quarter say, yeah, I have. I've stopped listening to a podcast because I heard the same ad too many times. Well, how do you feel about hearing the same ad more than once in a single podcast episode? People do take notice of that. 41% say it becomes annoying over time. And another 11%, again, we're talking about that 9, 10, 11, that roughly 10% of Americans who are just really, really cranky about ads say that they strongly dislike it. So you can wrap that up. A little over half say that it's annoying over time or strongly disliked. And another 36% say it's tolerable, right? So from the get-go, it's not a positive for people to hear the exact same ad more than once in a single podcast episode. Look at this by gender, and this sort of holds true with some of the other data that we looked at. With women, they're less tolerant of this sort of thing. They're a little bit less tolerant of too many ads, and they're a bit less tolerant of repetition of the same ad in a single episode. So it's absolutely a factor here. Now, how many times can you really get away with playing the same ad in an episode? There's a pretty clear answer to this. And it's one or two, but one is better. And I'll sort of point that out with this graph. In your opinion, what's an acceptable number of times to hear the same ad in a single podcast episode? Well, 40% say once, and another 50% say twice, right? Now, you could add that up together and say 90% say it's okay once or twice, but you could look at this a different way as well. 60% say it's not okay to have more than one. So that's something to really look at, right? That's basically, you can have too much of a good thing. You can have too many ads that are the same ad repeated in the same episode, and people will notice it. Females do tend to be a little bit more sensitive to that. So what happens when you have repeated ads, when you're playing the same ad in an episode? Well, the perceptions of repetitive ads initially affect consumer attitudes about the product, believe it or not. But over time, it can hurt the podcast as well, and can erode perceptions of the podcast itself, again, over time. So first, we ask people about the product or service. How does hearing the same ad more than once in a single podcast episode affect your perception of the advertised product or service? More than a third, 36%, say it decreases my interest, and another 10%, a magic number here, says it makes them actively dislike it, right? So the initial, I guess, ire that is taken out here is taken out on the brand, is taken out on the product or service. Now, thinking about your favorite podcast that has ads, does hearing the same ad more than once affect your overall attention to that podcast? Well, about 2/3 say no. And you do get a sort of a split here between decreases and increases. Need some liquid death here to continue on ad nauseam. And by the way, increasing attention isn't necessarily a positive. It makes you aware of it, but that doesn't mean you're aware of it in a positive sense. But in general, 16% say it decreases their attention to the podcast. That's not bad. That's a much better result than, I guess, the damage done to the product or service. But does the repetition of the same products or brands affect your overall attention to your favorite podcast that has ads? 23% now say, yeah, it will decrease my attention. That number goes up a little bit. And then finally, if you start to notice more frequent repetition of the same product or brand in your favorite podcast, how does your reaction change over time? And now it's up to 29%. So it's gone from 16%, you do it once, 23%, now 29% if you do it a lot. So you can push the boundaries here. And look, this shows up. That's a significant percentage. It's not a boundary that you want to push. It's not something you want to be known for doing. It's something you can get away with. I hesitate to phrase it that way. But if it happens, it happens. I think we've already seen that consumers can be very forgiving. But if you make a habit of it, if it is a systemic problem, it will not only impact the brand or product, impact your buyer, it will impact people's perception of the podcast itself. Now, unfortunately, as we know in the advertising business, frequency plays a role in driving action, and frequency absolutely plays a role in driving action in podcasts. I'll go back to this that I showed you earlier. 58% discovered a product or service, 45% purchased a product because of an ad they heard on a podcast, right? So, yes, podcasts work. We know that. That's something that we need to take into account. And repetition and frequency, maybe not frequency on the same show, do play into that. Before making a purchase, and these are amongst people that say they purchased a product or service due to an ad, how many times do you estimate you heard the ad? And this is people admitting that frequency works. This is people telling you, 2/3 say, well, I heard it 2 or 3 times. Another 14%, 5 times, and another 11% more than 5 times, right? Hearing it once, not particularly effective. This is the audience telling you that, acknowledging that, yeah, I have to hear something a few times for it to work, right? So we know repetition or frequency in some fashion is integral to performance. How long after hearing the ad for the last time did you decide to make that purchase? Once somebody hears something and it locks in a few times, as we mentioned, they're going to make that purchase fairly quickly. 14% immediately, 61% within a week. So 74% overall, a week or less. That's pretty recent, right? Some of that is down to the types of products and services, particularly direct response, performance marketing in podcasting, where that's certainly possible. It may not pertain to buying a car, for instance, but largely people will buy something fairly directly after it is locked in, and it takes a few times to lock it in. But you have to get a holistic view of the listener. You can't just look at it on a per show or even per network basis. A planner, a media buyer, and really everybody involved with the campaign has to consider the entire campaign across multiple channels when you're thinking about frequency. When we ask people who purchased a product or service, did they hear that ad on just one podcast? Well, more people said multiple podcasts than just one podcast. So that's an important part of it. So that's a factor of frequency that does not drive annoyance as much. People are more forgiving of that because those are choices that they have made if they're only hearing that ad once on those podcasts. It's when they hear it more than once, and especially more than twice in the same podcast, that it starts to really kind of nibble at them, right? Kind of get into the back of their head that this is an annoyance. So people, again, acknowledging it takes multiple impressions. I hear it on multiple podcasts, and I encounter the ad in multiple other channels. Only 20% of people who bought something from a podcast say they only heard it on a podcast. You encounter the ads everywhere. 80% overall encountered the purchased product or service somewhere else: social media, YouTube, television, or somewhere else, right? So all of this is a factor in terms of frequency and in repetition. But ultimately, and let's keep this one secret between us, if we don't annoy the listener, they're very likely to credit podcasting and the podcast ad for their interest in a product, even in a multi-channel campaign. We asked all of those people who said that they had bought something that had heard about it on a podcast, and 80% of them heard about it in other channels, remember, social media, YouTube, etc. How influential was the podcast ad? 72% said it was very or somewhat influential in their decision to purchase. So in a multi-channel campaign, podcasting, I think, will get more than its fair share of credit in terms of attribution, whether that's attribution that's determined through technology or through a survey or both or a hybrid. People will credit the podcast. So we can count on frequency happening. We can count on frequency and repetition happening across multiple shows and across multiple channels. So when it happens within an episode, that's where we really start to run into trouble. Now, I want to highlight one aspect of how we know all of this works. And I've put this in a separate section, but it's really sort of 4.5 here. The promo code. We've put out a little bit on promo codes in the past, but this is really some kind of interesting stuff on promo codes that we had not really been able to put out before, because it's one of the things that drives people remembering ads. It's one of the things that actually captures attention. And in this case, it's some repetition that can be forgiven because it can result in people getting a good deal. For people who say that they hear the same ads or brands too much, and there are a fair number of them, which we'll get to, we asked the reasons that might make it more tolerable to hear an ad repeatedly. Well, I'll get back to the top two here, but the third one, a good offer or discount. Something that has a good offer or discount is memorable in the right way, as opposed to something that's annoying and completely repetitive, right? So this is one of the things that makes it tolerable to hear something repeatedly, is that it has a good offer or discount. Have you ever used a promo code? We asked. More than a third say, yes, I have. I've used a promo code that I've heard in a podcast ad, right? This is amongst the entire audience, not just purchasers. So uh, that's a fair percentage of the people who say they've bought something from a podcast ad, which, if you recall, was about 45%, right? So this is a significant percentage of people who buy for people that podcast ads are really effective with. 34% overall say they've used a promo code. And there's some sort of interesting demographic and also multicultural differences here in this data. Men more likely to use one, younger people more likely to use one, Hispanic and Black audiences more likely to use one as well. So there are some differences here, but overall, that's a fairly high number, I would say, that about a third of the weekly podcast audience say they've used a promo code. That's a pretty high number when you look at it like that. When was the last time you used such a code? 45% within the last month, 44, 45% within the last month, a little bit over a third more than a month ago, right? So again, fairly recent, not something that they necessarily did back in 2015 or something. It's a recent behavior. People are remembering that they did it recently. How did you remember that last promo code? I love this question. There's lots to look at here. Top answer, I made a note or I wrote it down to use later. Love to see that. Again, this is amongst people who have used a promo code. Almost 4 in 10 of them say, I wrote it down. All right. That's, again, them telling you that advertising works. That's them telling you that they remembered an ad, they remembered a code, and they wrote it down to use later, with another 23% saying they used it right away. I want to highlight these two. And again, people could select more than one here. This will add up to over 100. But 20% say they looked it up in the show notes. 18% looked it up on the podcast's website. Those are sort of hygiene level things that you need to be doing if you're not, because the audience has that expectation, right? So those are ways that we can ensure that these promo codes are being used. People might remember the exact code, they might write it down, or they might just remember that it was on your show. So it better be in your show notes, and it better be on a podcast specific website. But going back to something I pointed out earlier with the percentage of people who did not believe that ad skipping hurt the creators, creators and hosts have to do a better job tying the performance of these codes and the performance of these discounts and the performance of ads in general to the success and continued production of the show. And that doesn't mean the show needs to be about commerce all the time, but I do think people need to understand that when you use a promo code, it's really helping that show. And I'll point this out. Why did you choose to use the promo code? Top answer, as you might expect, there was a good discount. This answer is the lowest answer. Now, that's not necessarily a small number, but I would like to see it higher. 19% say I want the podcast to get credit for my purchase. Well, I would like that to be 100%. Now, it's never going to be 100%, but I think that, again, is indicative of that stronger tie that the hosts can do, the creators can do, and the production team behind a show can do to actually improve that linkage between, this isn't just a discount that the brand is offering you. This is a discount that I am delighted to be able to share with you as your friend, the creator of this podcast. So we're going to wrap up here with the biggest topic in a lot of ways, and that's creative execution. Ad quantity here, we've talked a lot about repetition and the number of ads and number of ad breaks. It's less important than ad quality. Just as consumers will remember a great ad, they will equally remember a lousy ad. Both stick out in similar ways, right? And that's what can dramatically influence ad skipping, and it can dramatically influence the perceptions that people have about the quantity of ads that you have if they remember a few bad ones. So I'm going to tackle some of these things one by one. And these are kind of the ad skipping reasons that we talked about a little bit earlier. What primarily motivates you to skip ads in your favorite podcast? I wrote today in the newsletter about some of the things that I think people often think about ad skipping, that, people always skip ads. Not true. That ad skippers are just bad people. They're just scofflaws who are trying to skate by without compensating creators. Not necessarily true, right? Or that the whole system is broken, that advertising doesn't work. Also, not true. I've just shown you a whole bunch of evidence to the contrary. What is really true is there are multiple reasons why people skip ads. And only one of them on this page is I don't want to hear any ads. A lot of them have to do with things that are in our control. I'll give you one example, and we'll kind of go right to left here. Differences in volume. Now, this looks like a small number. 9% of people who ever skip ads say that what motivates them is differences in volume. It seems like a small number. It's not necessarily a small number. It's also pretty fixable. If I told you that you could decrease your ad skipping by a noticeable percentage, if this problem were fixed, if the volume fluctuations, if everyone could get their luffs in a row, wouldn't you want to fix that, right? Well, let's fix that, right? That's something that's addressable by us, by the industry, to combat ad skipping. That's something that's in our control. And that's something that at least some percentage, a non-ignorable percentage of listeners, are telling us that they notice. Now, some people just don't like any ads. And we've talked about that before, but podcasting also has fewer of those people, I think, than other media options and other media channels. And that's that 26% there who say, I prefer to consume content without interruptions. You're going to get them in every media channel, right? They're always going to be people who are just like, I would just rather skip ads. And that's not something you can necessarily do anything about, right? That 26%. But you can do something about it, I think, by addressing the other things on this page by making the ads less skippable. I already showed you this graph. Users of each medium who watch or listen to all of the ads they encounter on podcasts is much, much higher with podcasting than it is in any other medium. So we have the opportunity here, even though there's ad skipping or ad avoidance in all of these things, our audience is more attentive. The podcast audience is more attentive. And therefore, I think there's a lot more that we can do with the things that are in our control to make ad skipping even less of an issue. We can never forget the top reason why people come to podcasts. Anytime you ask people, why do you listen to podcasts? You're going to get one or two answers with most people. And one of them is to learn something new. I want to learn something new. These are curious people. These are people who want to educate themselves. And when you excessively repeat the same execution of the same ad, that's violating that expectation. You're taking with an audience that's come to learn something new, and you're giving them sort of the same old thing over and over. What primarily motivates you to skip ads in your favorite podcast? 28%. I'm already familiar with the advertised product or service. Some of that maybe not in your control if it's a really heavy advertiser across all channels. But if frequency capping and frequency issues and repetition are playing into that, again, that's something that we need to work on as an industry. We need to ensure that that doesn't happen. We need to push back against advertisers who want to do that because our audience is different. They're paying closer attention. They're going to notice things a lot more. Thinking about the brands and products you hear advertised on podcasts, do you agree or disagree with the following? I hear the same ads too much. 65% say I hear the same ads too much. That's not learning something new, right? That's not learning something new. Why are you tired of hearing the same ads? I'm not learning anything new. People are telling you this over and over. This is the use case for so many people about why they come to podcasts. They come to podcasts to hear something new. The podcast excites them. The podcast pays that off. But if they're getting the same ad repeated in that show, if they're not getting a variance in creative execution, or if they're just getting a bad ad, that's going to stand out to them as not paying off that promise, right? And in fact, and I'll say a little bit about this at the very end as we wrap up. If you have the choice between not running an extra ad or running the same ad twice for an advertiser as a value add, now you might rethink that. That might be damaging both of you in ways that that maybe you haven't thought about, given what we've already seen about intra-episode repetition in this study. Finally, podcasting is entertainment. Creators put a lot of effort into making 26 minutes of every 30 entertaining, funny, and interesting, right? The best we can do is to hold our ads to the same standard. And I want to just share a really quick story about that. I used to do a lot of work with a company called Broadcast Architecture back in the 90s. And my boss there, Frank Cody, was a real legend in programming. He's a very passionate man, very passionate about quality entertainment, about educating sales teams, and trying to make the entire product as compelling as it could be. And I remember I was driving in LA with him, I think, and we were listening to a client station, and it was really a mood station. It was designed to kind of relax you. It was a great station to have driving around LA with the top down, and we heard like it's just absolute screaming Mitsubishi ad, just completely excoriating you for not yet buying a car, you cretin. Um, and it made Frank so angry, as angry as he gets. He was a gentleman. And I remember actually going into the station with him and just sort of laying it out there. Look, you're spending a lot of money with us to make 45 minutes of every hour really great and to make 45 minutes of every hour incredibly relaxing for people. Don't screw it up with the other 15. And I think with podcasting, we work really hard on that 26 minutes out of every 30 or whatever it is for you to not screw it up for the rest of that, right? We have to hold ourselves to the same standard. It's a different medium. What makes it more tolerable to hear an ad repeatedly? It's entertaining or it's funny. Again, people come to podcasts because they want to learn something new or they want to be entertained. And if an ad is entertaining, if an ad is interesting, then people will stick with it. They'll stick with multiple repetitions of it, right? Because it is something that is paying off on the promise of the podcast itself. What primarily motivates you to skip ads in your favorite podcast? The top answer: lack of interest or relevance. Lack of relevance, that's a targeting thing, perhaps. Lack of interest, that's down to advertising creative, my friends. That's down to putting as much work into communicating with this audience about products and services as we do with the show. And that's really, really important because this is such a precious gift, this audience. It is such a precious jewel. It's an audience that I've talked about for years that gives you more attention, that gives you more love, that gives you more revenue, that gives you more dollars. And we can't afford to disrupt that too much. We can push the envelope a little bit, but we always have to be aware of consumer expectations. And if people are listening to a show to learn something new and to be entertained, and they're exposed to too many parts of that show that do neither, that's when they're going to revolt. And I think this is something that podcasting needs to do more of. I think, we have to have higher standards about ad creative. We can't just reuse creative from other things. We have to think about our unique audience. We have to entertain them. We have to intrigue them. We have to give them something interesting. We have to give them some variety. Think about the last podcast ad you remember hearing. What made it memorable? It was interesting. It was relevant. It fit well. It was funny. It was read by the hosts. These are all positive things. These are all possible. This is the audience telling us you can do it. We hear it. You can do it, right? It's certainly something that is available to us, that's open to us. It's a possibility for us. And it's clearly time to take my greyhounds out, which I'll get to here in a moment. They're letting me know that it's almost the end of the webinar. So one solution, by the way, to this is variety and form. And I love this question. Think about an ad type you're tired of hearing. What type of ad is it? Top answer here, sorry, is a generic announcer doing the ad, right? Those are those kinds of radio style repurposed broadcast ads I'm talking about. They stick out. They can actually add to a perception of frequency. They can add to a perception of repetition because they sound the same, even if they're not the same. So variety is a big part of that. Variety and form is a big part of that. And also trying sort of different approaches to an ad. Would you be more tolerant of ads in podcasts if they were different than what you typically hear? A mini drama, a song, a quick interactive segment. 57% say more tolerant. Could be the same brand, same product. You're just going at it a little bit more podcast friendly. So I'm going to get to some findings and summaries and then let you go within the hour as I promised. Again, want to give a very special note of gratitude to Wondery, ESPN Podcasts, BetterHelp, SiriusXM Podcast Network, Libsyn Ads, Paramount, and NPR for their marvelous support of this project. We're going to have a lot more to come from this over the course of the next coming months. Thank you very much to Paul and Jeff and the whole team at Signal Hill Insights. Again, marvelous partners in working to put this questionnaire together and the analysis together, all of that. In the downloadable version of this deck, I have put all of these key findings on ad effectiveness, ad skipping, ad frequency, ad repetition, and creative execution. That's all there for you, all the stats in 3 easy to digest slides. But I want to leave you with just a few quick action steps as we move forward to try to make this all, I think, come together and do something meaningful for this medium. Number one, let's not push it with quantity. Now, there may not be a right answer, but there are expectations, and you at least need to know that. Does that mean you always need to have 3 ads? No, but you need to know that most people generally perceive 3 as the right number. So when you are doing something different from that, you need to do something better than that. And that, I think, certainly speaks to ad creative and creative execution and quality and variety in forms. Second, people strongly remember 2 types of ads, really great ones. And we just saw some positive comments about ads that are funny and memorable and interesting. They also remember really, really terrible ones. And the quality of the creative actually has a significant impact on perceptions of quantity and repetition. People will tell you that you're not having a variety, that you're having sort of repetitive ads if they're hearing things that sound the same, even if they're not the same. 3, I mentioned this earlier, filling in unsold inventory with value-added spots for the same ad, same creative. It's probably not helping the brand or the show. It's something to think about. It probably does more immediate damage to the brand, but it can certainly damage the show itself. And I said this before, we have a great gift in the podcast listener. They're not afraid of ads. They don't reject them. And they'll pay more attention to them if we apply the same filter, the same standards to the ads as much as we can as we do the content. They should help they should help people learn something new. It should be genuinely interesting, intriguing, a new fact, be entertaining, and not be afraid to challenge traditional advertising forms. And then finally, if you're a host, if you're a creator, if you're on this side of the mic, let's do a better job explaining how this whole advertising deal works. Because if people behind the mic don't love them and don't make those strong ties and tie that success to the show, the listeners won't either. So to wrap all of this up, and I thank you for the last just almost 60 minutes of your time and attention, podcast listeners don't skip ads. They skip crap. So let's all do better. Let's not play crap. Let's work to up the game on podcast creative. Let's treat this audience like it is, like it's a special jewel. It's a very attentive jewel. It's an audience for whom advertising works spectacularly well, as long as we don't ruin podcasting with it. And that's it. So this will all be available very soon at soundsprofitable.com. I encourage you to download it there when that's up. Subscribe to our newsletter if you haven't already. And again, thanks very much to our wonderful sponsors. Thanks to Gavin. Thanks to Newt. Welcome. And to my partner, Brian Barletta. And thanks to all of you for welcoming us into your laptop and computer screens. I'm Tom Webster for Sounds Profitable. We'll see you next time.